As a longtime Thomas fan, I've endured plenty of weird looks and petty judgments, and even while I wrote my thesis paper, there was one glaring misconception that followed me to the finish line. Wasn't there an engine who died in a tunnel? And all the questions along those lines that spawned from the popular interpretations spread during the 2010s. It has bothered me then, it bothered me during my last semester at college, and will always bother me unless I make this video. A video that I can point people to whenever I get that question. So let me denounce it here and now. No. Henry did not die in the tunnel. Furthermore, I completely oppose the idea that the island of Sodor is some sort of post-apocalyptic tyranny where Sir Topham Hatt is some despotic, capitalistic fat cat who cares nothing for the engines. If we look at the original stories in the books and the classic era of the show, that being the first 7 series, and not the nonsensical vacuum that is the subsequent hit era of the show, I argue there is plenty of evidence that proves Sodor is a place of community and cooperation. Now, if you're a longtime fan like me, I'm sure you're sick of hearing these conspiracies at this point, and are probably tired of all the baseless defamation that comes from these trigger-happy internet personalities. And while I definitely think it's good to look back at things with a critical lens, as we certainly will later, as well as a nostalgic one, yellow journalism doesn't help anyone except the writers who profit from it. So let's look at some of the articles that started churning this misinformation and how. The first article here is a Guardian article titled "The Tyrannical World of Thomas the Tank Engine." A promising start. The subheading and further content show a real passionate hatred for this series, which is honestly more concerning to me than the article itself. Though it doesn't surprise me that someone who writes like this would misconstrue the content in favor of a shocking article title. The aggression is very exaggerated, but when we finally make it to the main event, the article does its best to make Henry as sympathetic as possible with no pretense about hiding their agenda. Let's start with The Sad Story of Henry, in which a sentient engine is immured in a tunnel as punishment for being a tiny bit vain about keeping his paint job out of the rain. Henry was not just a tiny bit vain. He completely stopped the train and refused to move for anyone, even when the rain stopped and after all the passengers, as well as other engines, tried to get him out. Let me put it to you like this. If I pulled the emergency brake on the subway because I didn't want to get out on a wet platform, I would get jumped. So let's not act like Henry isn't holding up an entire train and disrupting an entire railway by blocking what was canonically the only tunnel, and not coming out despite the efforts of everyone. A second article titled "An Intellectual Review of Thomas and Friends," a really bold title considering what we're about to read, claims that eventually the Fat Controller forces people to rip Henry out of his home, all the while citing doctor's orders that he himself cannot help pull Henry out. Henry stays put in his house, and the Fat Controller punishes Henry for his insubordination by building a brick wall around him and having his rails removed. Already, so many things wrong here in this intellectual review. The Fat Controller never forces people to come out and push. I think it's fair to say that if my train was stuck, and if it was at all possible to get it going by pushing it, I would at least try. As for the Fat Controller himself not pushing or pulling, Awdry does admit that in an interview, this Fat Controller was based off of bureaucrats who would issue directives but didn't do anything themselves. But he emphasizes that this was only the first Sir Topham Hatt to do this. While this certainly seems like support for the other side, I don't think this deters from the argument that he still tries to reason with Henry and get his passengers to where they are going. But for the articles to contend that the trains represent the working class, slaving away all day delivering goods and providing services, while the Fat Controller profits from their toil, and the Fat Controller also relies on his workers to solve all their problems, is extremely reductive. The engines are not slaves that are forced to work. They serve their community as a family, as Awdry also prefers to call them in the same interview, because it is their home and they want to see it flourish, just as the Fat Controller does. And quite frankly, yes, Sir Topham Hatt does rely on his engines to solve a fair share of problems, because he depends on them to keep their home afloat, and the engines depend on him to take care and provide for them. Lastly, on a much more trivial note, and because I'm being a little petty towards these articles, this is not Henry's home. I don't even know how you could interpret it that way when the first line of the story says he went into a tunnel, blew out through his funnel, and didn't come out again. Intellectual review here. They go on to berate the episode saying Henry is left in his tunnel wondering if he will ever be able to pull trains again. There is no happy ending in this episode, there is no cheerful message. The message of this episode is simply that if you disobey your boss, you will be punished to a lifetime of depression and sadness. This is probably the worst interpretation I've heard yet. Henry doesn't refuse to work or simply disobey. He refuses to get wet. Sir Topham Hatt does not force people to get out and push or pull, and obviously we all know by now that he's not forever trapped in the tunnel. It turns out proof enough for this article is not actually close to anything at all. The first article so comically states that parents will turn to their child and say, "That's the end, sleep tight," as if parents or children won't let any more stories play after that, or if they're reading the book, turn the page. And as a third article writes, realizing the day's workflow is irrevocably disrupted, Fat Controller decides that Henry must be punished for life. We shall take away your rails and leave you here for always and always. This article, the repressive, authoritarian soul of Thomas and Friends, actually decides to use the words in the text to support their claim, which is an improvement, but I still find it reductive in its interpretation. When the Fat Controller says this, he is using it as a threat. That much is certain. But as mentioned, he has given Henry many opportunities to move, and has given up in convincing Henry. So is using this rhetoric to further scare Henry into changing his mind. In a practical sense, why would he want to lose one of his, at this point, very few engines he needs for his railway? Sir Topham Hatt is not primarily concerned with the workflow of his island. He is trying to run a railway and serve his community, including the passengers on the train who are trying to get somewhere by relying on them, and having been stranded by an engine who is more than a little vain. Which brings me to the main issue with this episode, that it ends on a cliffhanger. Although I know the second part would almost certainly come with it on the DVD release, and it is certainly in the same book. It just leaves opportunity for people to miss the second part. This is through no fault of the authors or producers though, as they are only trying to keep their audience interested in what happens next. And it is something that happens even today with shows that release episodes on a weekly basis or the like. Their viewer count can drop between episodes for many reasons, but nonetheless, some of those viewers will miss out and not get a resolution that may have been needed. One study by Veronica Kalmus, When the Villain Remains Unpunished, suggests the interruption of children's program viewing can lead to unsatisfying conclusions for them, and in our case, completely misconstruing the text. Considering that watching TV before bedtime is one of the main reasons for children's sleeping disorders, and violence remaining without punishment is harmful, it can be suggested that if children have already started to watch a crime drama, or Thomas in this case, it is better to let them watch the whole episode. This applies to cliffhangers too, and those parents that cut out the opportunity to see the redemption Henry gets in the next episode is probably more damaging to them. Again, this is not a fault in the writing, but it has clearly left these writers with the chance to use it against the show for many years. Henry, however, is not the only one who's been used as a scapegoat for why Thomas is a terrible show, but other characters and episodes have been reduced or misinterpreted to explain the world of Sodor as some sort of hellscape. One that is mentioned in both articles we've talked about so far is Bulgy, who is described as a blowhard socialist because he wears a sign saying, "Free the roads," and it being no coincidence that he's painted red. I find this one funny because it uses Bulgy's predicaments as being somehow evidence that socialism is decried because he gets trapped under a bridge, painted green, and converted into a henhouse. No context is given for these, by the way. Bulgy gets stuck under the bridge because he attempts to steal Duck and Oliver's passengers, with the allure that he knows a shortcut, that being the aforementioned bridge. The funny part of the socialism comment to me is that, if anything, Bulgy represents the worst of capitalism, really, as he is overly competitive and will use any means necessary to beat his opponents. And to rectify the later comments, yes, Bulgy is made into a henhouse, that is until he is painted green, before being turned into a vegetable truck, where he is shown to be a lot happier. Both articles make sure to mention Scruffy as another victim, almost like they're getting their information from the same place. Having caused intolerable levels of confusion and delay, the offending blue-collar worker is coupled between two engines pulling in opposite directions and yanked until he flies apart. And yes, both articles do mention that he's pulled in two different directions. So let's put this right. No. He is not pulled in two different directions, and not by two engines either, because he, as well as the rest of the trucks, are notorious for their chaos and holding back engines. When we see Scruffy pulled apart, he is holding back against Oliver to antagonize him and cause disruption. He is only given his comeuppance when his old frames can't handle the strain. Not only do we see Oliver get reprimanded by Sir Topham Hatt for this, showing that this is not endorsed on the railway, but Scruffy is literally shown to be repaired at the end of the episode. You're telling me both of these people couldn't sit through the rest of the 4.5 minutes? I think the greatest insult in the first article is when they say the Rev was more interested in nerding out over various heritage railways and attempting to preserve them in fiction than he was in maintaining a consistent fictional world of developing characters. So let's dissect this. First of all, Wilbur Awdry was an enormous fan of railways for sure, and used his stories to create a world that celebrated them and indeed preserved them in his fiction by being as faithful as possible. Secondly, he definitely did his utmost to make this world consistent and adhere to real-life railway practices since he was such a nerd, and was able to craft narratives in that world in a way that helped develop its characters. If we take a theme that was later butchered by the hit entertainment era, like the Steamies vs. Diesel one, we'll see characters like Gordon or James have an initial aversion to diesels because of past experiences or the things that they've heard, but come to admire and cultivate bonds with diesels like Boko. So if that isn't development, then I don't know what to tell you. Anyways, I do find it interesting the second article actually mentions the Smudger episode, the only one I could find that actually does, but only describes him as a show-off, and completely ignores his blasé attitude he holds towards the railway and the other engines that one could interpret as hostile. The fact that Smudger was turned into a generator is something I can see as more concerning for a show about trains, and it has a point of concern in the fandom. What I would argue though is that this was a different railway run by a completely different man who did not have the same principles as Sir Topham Hatt, and I don't think this should count against Sodor. In fact, I think it further supports the idea that Sodor is a sanctuary for steam engines and railways by showing the cruelty other owners have towards them. This article also mentions the spiteful brake fan, who isn't talked about more surprisingly, although I would argue that he is as well as bulgy and scruffy, all victims of circumstance or of their own hubris. I'm also shocked no one has ever used this one yet, but if these writers were to look into the book Mountain Engines, they'd find a story that was truly horrifying. Some of you may already know what I'm talking about, but in the story Bad Lookout, Culdee the Mountain Engine is brought to the works where he relays the story of Godred, an engine who acts very conceited and carelessly and ends up falling to his doom. As a result, he is never repaired and is used for spare parts for the other engines. Luckily, the story does tell us that Culdee made the story up, so really I think we should be examining Culdee's sanity. He's kind of scaring me. The article goes on to say that Sodor is a caste system where steam is on top and everything else is below it. My hunch for why anyone would think that is because of the horrible writing in the hit era, basically putting steam engines on a pedestal and making most of their diesel characters villains. Sodor is not a caste system where the steam is on top. Diesel, for example, does not struggle to prove himself as useful. He sabotages himself and others because he believes in diesel supremacy, similar to Bulgy. As a whole, the biases of steam or diesel come from an individual level, whether it be from steam engine's fear or aversion to change, which is also shown to be irrational in forms like Boko, Mavis, or Salty, or diesel's desire to dominate. The article then loses all respect for me when it uses Tumblr posts to pronounce that the series is a post-apocalyptic world where the island is a safe zone from a totalitarian dystopia. If you look at the books, something I doubt these people actually do, Awdry makes the effort to make the world as close to reality as possible and even tries to connect it to real life by referencing real places or engines. Think London, Barrow-in-Furness, Flying Scotsman, etc. Sodor certainly doesn't hide its intentions of being a safe haven for steam, but not because of some post-apocalyptic headcanon some rando on the internet made up to entertain themselves, but because there were and are real threats to steam as an outdated fuel source for transportation, and the desire to preserve steam is just as real, as there are many museums and heritage railways that seek to appreciate it for years to come. The article uses Percy's fear discussing the other railway, and tries to contend that Sir Topham Hatt keeps the engines in line by not telling them about it, again using Tumblr as evidence. It's pretty clear the engines are well aware of the situation they're in, as we talked about with Smudger, and as episodes like Escape, where the engines are in the midst of those who would rather see them scrapped, clearly show, this is a reality that they keep in the back of their minds and only serves to make them more grateful to Sir Topham Hatt for keeping them in service. The last example I found was actually referenced by one of these articles. It is a book called The Politics of Popular Culture, Negotiating Power, Identity, and Place, and the section that pertains to us is one written by Shauna Wilton, who I was surprised to see didn't just regurgitate the same arguments that we've debunked. I unfortunately did not get to read all of her work because Google Books didn't let me, but from what I did read, we have just one more example to refute. Wilton discusses the episode Thomas in Trouble, or Thomas Breaks the Rules in the US version, and as the book calls it, where a police officer calls Thomas dangerous for not having cow catchers. The book argues that Sir Topham Hatt challenges the authority of the police and gets Toby to replace the rebellious Thomas. Again, these people think they're so smart for reading in between these lines that they miss the actual lines themselves. The central conflict here is not that Sir Topham Hatt or Thomas are above the law. The story states that Thomas had a casual relationship with the previous officer officer and made sure to be careful when crossing. It is only when the new officer arrives, who has a dislike for engines, decides to come down on Thomas for something that was never a problem. Thus, the conflict begins. This is all too realistic for me. I've had many friends or personal experiences where you could park or drive in certain spots that are not a problem or that should be fine to park in, and some officers are cool about it, while there might just be one officer who ruins it for everyone because they are too particular or they don't have the same relationship with the people there. To me, it's not about finding loopholes or a way out of the law, but communities that share an understanding for one another. This brings me to the point of this video. I didn't just want to make fun of these articles and their radical misinterpretations of Thomas, although that was definitely fun. I wanted to bring something more to this discussion. These articles wish to paint the world of Sodor as a dictatorship, where the engines work as slaves who are punished harshly for their mistakes. What I'd like to claim here is the complete opposite, and what I've been saying this whole time. Sodor is a place of community, and I'd go as far to say that it's a place held together by mutual aid. We've mentioned many systems like capitalism and tyranny, and I've tried to give reasons why Sodor does not fit into those labels, but in order to explain how Sodor fits more in line with a mutual aid system, we'll have to define it first. For that purpose, I'm using Alex Gitterman's book, Handbook of Social Work with Groups, which will help us outline some of the characteristics of what a mutual aid system looks like. For instance, Schwartz's reciprocal model, or the mutual aid model, is rather self-explanatory to some degree, as the concept of reciprocity would entail the mutually dependent relationship of those in a group as well as between groups and their social environment. More specifically from the book itself, people are brought together for many reasons. To organize themselves for action on special interests and common concerns, to help each other face difficult problems, experiences are communicated among the members, and the worker is surrounded by a host of surrogate helpers, each claiming a share of the supportive function. As we talked about before with Henry and his service to the railway, the engines are brought together as a part of this community and take on a role that they can fulfill to help each other as well as the railway itself. We can see many examples of certain engines taking on certain jobs or certain roles. Gordon, the primary example with his express, Percy in the mail, Thomas, Duck, and Edward having their own branch lines, etc. They all use their skills and abilities to support their community in the best way they can. Schwartz also puts forth, the important fact is that this is a helping system in which the clients need each other as well as the worker. This need to use each other to create not one, but many helping relationships is a vital ingredient of the group process and constitutes a common need over and above the specific task for which the group was formed. To this end, I'd like to direct your attention to some examples from the Skarloey Railway, who work as a close-knit community whose passengers depend on the engines and who the engines can depend on as well. 4 little engines, gallant old engine, and we can even throw Edward's exploit, just to give some credit to the big engines, all show the dedication the engines have towards their railway and their passengers. And while they are rewarded with repairs or paint or similar things, the reason they do it is because they love their home and its people, and want what's best for it. In the episode Bulldog, not only does it show us one of the most heroic stories, but can teach us a few things about the principles of the engines and their passengers. And yes, if we're being technical, this was also a different railway than the Skarloey, but I still think it shows us the general mutual aid relationship that these characters gravitate towards. When Falcon refuses to listen to Duke's wisdom, he puts himself in a precarious situation where Duke does his utmost to save him. He does so, thankfully, thanks in no small part to the passengers who, like with Henry, are not forced to help the situation in this case, and show compassion for the engines who are willing to show compassion for them. Moments like these capture a relationship between the individual and its nurturing group. Each needs the other for its own life and growth, and each reaches out to the other with all possible strength at a given moment. In Passengers and Polish, Duncan is very clearly the most rebellious engine, and we don't even need a police officer to determine that, who doesn't agree with anyone and has no consideration for passengers, and by extension, the railway itself. By viewing the railway as a symbiosis that requires its members to establish and maintain a favorable interchange with the environment and a mutual aid system among its members, we can see engines like Duncan jeopardize that relationship between the railway and its milieu because he refuses to cooperate in Gitterman's definition of group work, which functions along the lines of the growth and development of the individual, something that Duncan does throughout the series when he finally learns the value of commitment, not for the sake of polish, but for the sake of others, and the development of the group, which comes when the engines work together for their common goals and become closer because of it, just as Rusty and Skarloey do over the course of a few stories by looking out for each other and being able to confide in each other over things like their concerns with Duncan. To add on to this idea of an emotional support system in mutual aid communities, we can see a lot of that in the series with various characters, engine or otherwise. These bonds are crucial for the well-being of these communities, as it should go without saying that maintaining healthy relationships with those close to you and others who are a part of your milieu can only benefit you and your environment. Group members' empathy and support allow members to accept their own feelings in new ways. Members provide each other mutual support not only through their expressions of caring, but also through mutual demands for them to risk their real thoughts and ideas, listen to each other, and put their own concerns aside at times to help another. Interactions like the ones we've discussed, like Scarloway and Rusty confiding in each other, or even Scarloway and Nancy being the little girl who volunteers to help polish the engines, exemplify this ability to support one another, not just vocationally or physically, but emotionally as well, which can take many forms. Though we've talked at length about the value of dreaming and measuring expectations through the conversation and following story between Percy and Duck in All at Sea, the fact that the two are able to have this conversation and Duck is able to take that risk helps to demonstrate the emotional connection these engines make with another, even though the conversation isn't particularly helpful only because of Percy's naivete. The prime example for this idea is in the episode The Deputation, where the engines all share their concerns over Donald and Douglas's predicament, and elect Percy to be their representative, who brings their concerns to Sir Topham Hatt's attention. When he finally addresses the engines, he clarifies, "I understand your feelings, but I do not approve of interference," which would suggest to those authors that he doesn't allow his authority to be questioned, but I would argue that he simply wants his direction to be trusted by his engines, since he does try to keep the engine's best interests at heart. As Gitterman puts forth, the worker must also be responsive to the needs of each individual member as well as the needs of the collectivity. The worker uses additional skills to help a group to develop a satisfactory balance between meeting the needs for group integration and individuation. Sir Topham Hatt decides to keep Donald and Douglas because he sees the compassion in them for a railway they've only called home for a short while, and values the relationships and dedication they've exhibited. Despite the mistakes they've made, Sir Topham Hatt gave them the chance to prove themselves. Sir Topham Hatt wants to give his engines a chance, which is why Henry came out of the tunnel, or why despite his poor performance at first, Sir Topham Hatt gave him special coal, and after his accident with the Flying Kipper, he was sent to get completely repaired. Henry did not die in the tunnel. He was given the chance to be a part of the family, and when he was given that chance, he finally proved himself. All that being said, I still want to admit that Sodor is not a perfect mutual aid model, or for that matter, perfect in general. The island is full of many different personalities and just as many egos, and many stories revolve around the fact that many of them don't always see eye to eye. I should also mention that if you look at the Railway series, Scruffy doesn't get his second chance, but I think the whole trucks are anarchists or blue-collar workers is a question for another time. That being said, one thing that I had trouble applying to this community with absolute certainty was the belief that when members are clear about what behaviors are preferred, permitted, prescribed, and prohibited, they are likely to be less anxious and more available to each other, which is something I believe is present in this community, but may be obscured by the ample teasing and arguing. But that is the point of these stories, to show how flawed individuals can come together for a common purpose and find friendship from it. By being able to work out their differences to help make their home a better place, they in turn become better for it. Which is what I think Awdry wandered from the plain and boring moral stories he had to read as a kid, to see more of himself and the people around him in those stories, and not some perfect fiction that should loom over you and guilt you for your faults. So I think it's okay that Thomas is not a perfect mutual aid model, because we can see the community there has a good foundation for finding harmony, and comforts us by telling us that if these characters who bicker and disagree can get along, then so can we.